Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the initial kind of unsettling steps that our unnamed narrator
Ah,
takes as she enters into Maxim de Winter's life. And of course, the ever-present shadow of his late wife, Rebecca, right?
right.
You shared some great excerpts with me, and what we're going to try to do is unpack it all chronologically. So, from the narrator's anxieties, those sun-drenched anxieties, I guess you could say, in Monte Carlo, all the way to their arrival and her arrival specifically at Manderley. So let's jump right in. What struck you immediately about the narrator's self-awareness at the start of the book?
Well, right from the very beginning, I was really struck by the narrator's acute sense of her own um, place in the world, right?
Yeah.
She tells us right away that she's overcome a crisis, but she's clearly not unscathed,
Yeah.
right? And you get the sense that she prizes, above all else, this sort of present peace and security that she finds herself in at the beginning of the story. And it's almost as if she's making a conscious effort to turn away from what she calls, quote, melodrama, right? From the melodramatic nature of her past.
Yeah.
And this yearning for tranquility is then immediately set against the kind of turbulent undercurrents that define Manderley,
Yeah.
right? And so you have this real tension that's set up right from the beginning between her desire for a kind of peaceful and quiet existence and this incredibly complicated and kind of Gothic estate that she's about to enter into.
Absolutely. And I think it's really fascinating how Du Maurier sort of uses those small, seemingly insignificant details
Yeah.
to build this incredibly thick atmosphere. I'm thinking, for example, about the narrator's focus on, the everyday routines, like the 2 slices of bread and butter that she eats and her Chinese tea. She mentions it more than once, and it's such a mundane image. But then she contrasts this with her memories of tea at Manderley, which is, as you say, a much more ritualistic kind of event where they sit by the library fire with Jasper.
Yeah, the Spaniel.
Yeah, who's completely feigning indifference to the cake.
Right.
But even in that simple act of having tea, you can already sense the pull of the past, right? That she doesn't fully grasp yet.
Right. And that seemingly small detail, right? The contrast between these two tea settings
Yeah.
actually offers, I think, one of the most crucial insights into the novel early on. It
Mm.
reveals that even before she sets foot there, right, Manderley exists as this incredibly potent symbol in the narrator's mind. And it's this romanticized ideal that stands in such stark contrast to the kind of mundane reality that she's seeking to escape in Monte Carlo. So you're right. I think Du Maurier really sets up this central tension in the novel right from the beginning, which is this push and pull between her desire for a kind of peaceful present
Mm.
and this very complicated and rich reality of the past that she's about to inherit.
Yes. And then, of course, we have the grand entrance of Maxime de Winter,
Yeah.
who is being observed, of course, very closely by Mrs. Van Hopper
Of course. Yeah.
when he enters the dining room. I love that little detail where the head waiter gives him particularly deep bows when he arrives.
Right.
You immediately know that this is someone of importance. And of course, Mrs. Van Hopper is, well, she's like a heat-seeking missile, as you said, for anyone with a title.
That's a great way to put it.
What did you make of her immediate interest in him?
It's almost comical how blatant it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, her reaching for her lorgnette is this wonderful visual detail that Du Maurier gives us to really demonstrate her almost predatory interest in Maxim.
Right.
And I think what makes it even funnier is the narrator's own discomfort with the whole situation. You know, she feels this kind of urge to warn Maxim, but she's held back by her own, sense of propriety, which is, I think, a very relatable conflict.
Absolutely. And it's almost painful, I think, to witness those early exchanges between Mrs. Van Hopper and Maxim, her incredibly direct, intrusive questions about Manderley, about, things like the cloister, the art gallery,
Right.
and her very confident assumptions about its, long family history and potential royal connections.
Right.
It's just it's one after the other, these questions. And Maxim is, he's polite, but he's also very firm in deflecting those questions. And he has this clear disinterest in Palm Beach, which is where Mrs. Van Hopper is trying to steer the conversation. You can practically feel his weariness, I think, in those moments.
Totally.
What do you think his silence during these exchanges reveals about his character, even at this early stage?
I think the silence speaks volumes, right? I mean, you can almost feel his humiliation as Mrs. Van Hopper keeps, sort of, you know, pushing these questions onto him and intruding on his personal space.
Right.
And then, of course, he abruptly departs. And what does Mrs. Van Hopper do? She immediately pursues him, right?
Yeah.
And du Maurier describes her as being full of anxiety and fearing she might miss her prey.
Yeah.
So I think this really paints a vivid picture not only of Mrs. Van Hopper's character, but also of Maxim's desire to kind of escape that world of, kind of superficial interaction.
Absolutely. And then, of course, the narrator returns to her table and finds that Maxim is already seated there with Mrs. Van Hopper. It's like this force of nature is just impossible to escape.
Right. It's like she's inescapable.
Yeah, exactly. But then we have that really unexpected twist where Maxim extends this very surprising invitation to the narrator to join them for drives. And that feels like a real turning point in the story, doesn't it?
It absolutely is a turning point. Because this marks the beginning of their direct interaction.
Right.
And immediately, you get the sense that the narrator is conflicted about this, right? She observes Maxim's ability to sort of shut off emotionally.
Yes.
Which is, as you read on, is going to become a characteristic that's quite significant in the novel.
Yes.
There's this distance about him, this real guardedness. And, it makes you wonder if this initial connection for Maxim isn't really about romance so much as it is about something else entirely.
Yeah, which makes his apology for his earlier abruptness all the more significant.
Absolutely.
Doesn't it? It's like, just for a moment, that emotional wall that he's built up comes down just a tiny bit.
Right.
And then the narrator very hesitantly mentions Manderley, and
yeah,
the wall goes right back up.
Yeah.
The immediate withdrawal, the silence, it creates this very powerful sense of a forbidden topic, something that's weighing on him.
It is, and it's important to note that this silence isn't just some kind of, cheap plot device to create mystery, right? It's a really masterful way that du Maurier builds suspense by using omission.
Right.
It's almost like this negative space that she creates. And, it's a technique that you often see in Gothic literature, which Rebecca draws upon in very subtle ways.
Right.
And so Manderley, through this silence, is immediately established not just as a place, but as a symbol of something incredibly significant and potentially very painful in Maxim's past.
Absolutely. And the narrator has this fleeting memory of a picture postcard of a grand house that she thinks is evocative of Manderley.
Right.
And it just reinforces that sort of almost mythical quality that the estate seems to hold in her imagination, which stands in such contrast, as you were saying, to the reality that she will soon encounter.
Totally. Yeah.
So we see Maxim lost in these periods of deep thought. And the narrator's concern just grows and grows.
And grows.
Right. You can sense that he's really struggling with some inner turmoil. And then there's this sudden shift where he starts to speak almost poetically about Manderley in the springtime.
Yeah.
He talks about the setting sun, the sea, those beautiful blooming flowers.
The narcissus.
Yeah, the crocuses, the snowdrops, the primroses, bluebells. And it's this incredibly vivid, beautiful image that he paints for her.
It is.
What do you make of that, sudden outpouring of emotion?
It's such a stark contrast to the kind of emotionally closed-off man that we've seen up to this point, right? And this passionate, almost lyrical description that he gives of Manderley reveals this really deep connection that he has to the estate, a love for it that seems completely at odds with his, decision to be in Monte Carlo, right? To be away from this place that he clearly loves so much. And I think it really raises that central question, right?
Yeah.
If he loves Manderley so much, why is he in Monte Carlo?
Yeah, exactly. And the narrator picks up on this as well. She wonders why he would seek out the, quote, false brilliance of Monte Carlo if he loves Manderley so deeply. And she even imagines him walking those beloved paths pursued by the ghosts of his memories.
Right.
So their routine of drives then becomes this very fragile space, right?
Yeah.
Where their relationship is beginning to develop amidst all these unspoken tensions.
It is. And it's in these small, almost insignificant gestures, things like him lending her his coat, that the narrator finds so much joy.
Right.
It really highlights her naivete, I think, at this stage, and this very, very deep yearning for connection and for affection.
Absolutely. And her wish to be more sophisticated, Maxim's response, "You wouldn't be sitting here in this car," I think is a bit of a reality check.
Yeah.
But there's also this strange, endearing quality to his, his honesty and his lack of pretense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then she questions his kindness towards her, which I think is, a very genuine and kind of relatable moment of insecurity for the narrator. And then Maxim finally offers some sort of explanation for why he enjoys her company. What did you make of that?
Well, I think that's a crucial moment in the novel for us as readers, right?
Yeah.
Because we finally get a glimpse into Maxim's motivations. And he explicitly states that he wants to forget the past.
Yeah.
He wants to make a clean break. He wants to start anew.
Yeah.
And he says that the events of the previous year have been so transformative that he needs to kind of escape them. And then he says this incredible thing. He says that she silences the past for him, quote, much more effectively than all the lights of Monte Carlo.
Yeah.
Which is, I think incredibly revealing. Because it really suggests that his interest in the narrator, at least at this stage, isn't really about romantic love.
Right.
So much as it's about this need for escape and this need for a fresh start.
Right. It's almost utilitarian in a way, right?
Yeah, totally.
He's using her in a sense to escape his past, but then the relationship does take a turn towards the intimate, doesn't it? They're awkward. There's still that distance between them, and then all of a sudden he calls her Maxim and kisses her.
Right.
It's a really abrupt shift in his demeanor, and as a reader, you're kind of left breathless and wondering what his real feelings are.
Yes, it's definitely a sudden shift.
Yeah.
And I think it might even feel a little unsettling to some readers, right? Because it comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But I think it's undeniable that this marks a change in their dynamic, a shift towards something more personal.
Yeah.
And then, he says that really peculiar thing about her never wearing black silk. And it's such a specific detail, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, why black silk? What is the significance of that?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as readers, we know that this is a kind of subtle foreshadowing of Rebecca's iconic black dress,
Right.
which will, become a really important symbol later in the novel.
Right. And for the narrator, this kiss feels like a bridge has been crossed. Like this gap between them has finally been bridged. And she's already looking ahead and anticipating their future together, of course, at Manderley.
Okay.
And then, inevitably, Mrs. Van Hopper brings up Rebecca.
Of course she does, yes.
It's like this name is just hanging over everything.
Right.
And she's so tactless about it, you know?
Yeah.
She describes Rebecca as elegant, charming, adored by Maxim. But she also mentions her, quote, very sudden and tragic end.
Yeah.
And it's clear that those words are starting to plant these first seeds of doubt and comparison in the narrator's mind.
Totally. And this is really where that idealized kind of fairy tale version of Manderley that the narrator has been building up in her mind starts to show its first cracks.
Yeah, absolutely. And the narrator's reaction to Mrs. Van Hopper is really telling, I think.
Yeah.
Initially she was indifferent to her, and now she's suddenly filled with this hatred, this loathing for this woman.
Right.
And it's almost as if she's trying to blame Mrs. Van Hopper for disrupting this fragile happiness that she's found.
It's like Mrs. Van Hopper represents the outside world.
In a way. Yeah.
That's intruding on this kind of bubble that they've created.
And then she overhears that phone conversation.
Right.
Where Mrs. Van Hopper's talking about leaving. And it triggers this impulsive run to Maxim's hotel room.
Right.
Which du Maurier describes as very impersonal.
Yeah, she says it's, quote, a room in which any man might have lived.
Right.
Untidy and impersonal.
Yeah. And then amidst this impersonal setting, we have this very unconventional marriage proposal.
Right.
It's so unromantic, you know? There's no bended knee. There's no flowery language, no heartfelt declaration of love. Instead, he talks about Venice. And of course, he talks about Manderley.
Right.
And it's almost businesslike in its directness. But for the narrator, of course, this is everything she's ever wanted. But even in this moment of supposed joy and commitment, we have this unwelcome intrusion of the past.
Right. That forgotten book of poetry with the inscription, Max von Rebecca.
Yeah.
Which is such a stark reminder of the life that he shared with Rebecca, right?
Yes.
Before the narrator ever came into the picture. And I think the narrator's impulsive act of trying to cut out the von Rebecca from the inscription speaks volumes about her insecurity and her desire to somehow erase Rebecca even just symbolically.
Absolutely. And Mrs. Van Hopper, being the keen observer that she is, has these knowing and very cutting remarks about what she thinks is going on.
Right.
She makes these condescending comments about the narrator's lack of parents and the age difference between her and Maxim. And she really lays bare the kind of social awkwardness and the perceived imbalance of this match.
Yeah. And yet, despite all of this, despite all of these warning signs, and despite Mrs. Van Hopper's kind of blunt assessment of the situation, the narrator is absolutely determined to put the past behind her, right?
Right.
And she's fixated on building a future with Maxim. And she almost willfully ignores these red flags, these unsettling undercurrents.
I love that little detail of Mrs. Van Hopper's knowing smile in the mirror as she leaves. It's almost as if she's saying, good luck with that.
Right. You have no idea what you're getting into.
Exactly.
And then we have the arrival at Manderley. Just the sheer scale and grandeur of the estate must have been completely overwhelming for the narrator.
It must have been.
And then, of course, she meets Mrs. Danvers.
Right.
And from that very first encounter, you can just feel that something is profoundly off.
Oh, absolutely. Her presence is immediately significant and unsettling. I mean, think about how she first greets the narrator. She inquires about her wishes, but she also emphasizes her own long tenure at Manderley.
Right.
And she immediately draws this contrast between the present and the time when Mrs. de Winter was alive.
Yeah. It's very pointed, isn't it? Oh, absolutely. I think she's establishing a very specific tone, and I would even say an adversarial tone for their relationship.
Right from the start. And then she just keeps going, doesn't she? She describes how active the house was when Rebecca was alive.
Right.
All the constant social engagements, the parties, the guests.
Yeah.
And it almost suggests that the new Mrs. de Winter could never possibly measure up.
Right. And it's a very subtle but very powerful form of intimidation.
Absolutely. And the narrator is really aware of Mrs. Danvers' presence, that kind of constant shadow that seems to be following her, and those very pointed questions, seemingly innocent questions, about whether she's happy, whether she's satisfied,
Yeah.
and then that unsolicited information about Maxim's wardrobe.
Oh, yeah.
And how it won't quite fit into the new Mrs. de Winter's room.
Right.
It's another way of emphasizing Rebecca's presence and kind of undermining the narrator.
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting is that Maxim enters at that moment
Yeah.
all full of enthusiasm and compliments for Mrs. Danvers.
Hmm.
He's praising her for the way she's transformed the room. And it's almost as if he's completely oblivious to this tension that's just hanging in the air.
Right. Or maybe he's just used to it, as you were saying.
Maybe. Or maybe he chooses to be oblivious
Yeah.
because it's easier than confronting it.
Right. And then Mrs. Danvers gives those instructions about the morning room,
Right.
And she describes Rebecca's routine.
In great detail.
Yeah, very precisely. And of course, the narrator is embarrassed.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't know about this important room. And then she tries to appear knowledgeable to Frith.
Yeah, and fails miserably.
And then, of course, that funny little moment with the door.
Oh, yeah.
Where instead of leading to the morning room, she ends up in this garden room.
Right.
It just shows how lost she is in this huge estate. What do you make of those initial impressions of Manderley,
It's such a mix of anticipation and unease.
Yes.
On the one hand, the narrator is excited to be there.
Yeah.
She talks about wanting to go walking and swimming, but then Beatrice immediately kind of brings her down to earth,
Yeah.
describing the cold water and the stony beach.
Right.
And there's this awkward silence after the narrator mentions swimming in the bay.
Yeah.
It's just thick with, unspoken memories and a kind of pity for the narrator's naivete.
Yeah, and that sense of pity is really reinforced when Beatrice reacts to the narrator's assertion that she'll come to love Manderley.
Yeah. It's not very convincing, is it?
No, it's not. It's more like a polite hope than a genuine belief. And then, Beatrice asks these questions about the narrator's time in the south of France, but she doesn't seem to be really listening.
Right.
And then she makes that comment about the marriage being quite sudden. And again, there's this sense of, hoping for the best, but not really believing in it. It really makes you wonder what the family really thinks of this union.
Totally. And I think the narrator herself picks up on this, right?
Yeah.
She observed the relationship between Beatrice and Giles.
Yeah.
And she wonders why Beatrice married him. And then she thinks, well, maybe Beatrice is just as perplexed by Maxim's choice of me.
You're right.
And, it all speaks to this feeling of being an outsider, of looking in on this world that she doesn't really understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And that casual affection between Maxim and Beatrice, it makes the narrator feel almost like a pet.
Yeah, like Jasper the dog.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And then du Maurier gives us this really nice description of this sleepy afternoon at Manderley.
right.
You know, the freshly cut grass, the smoke rising from the library chimney.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of normalcy, but there's this tension underneath it all.
Right. And then Beatrice recounts Mrs. Lacey's assumption that the narrator would be, this elegant and worldly woman.
Yeah.
And it's just another one of those little digs, those comparisons to Rebecca.
Right, exactly. And then, of course, there's that moment where Maxim describes Beatrice as being occasionally stupid, which is
Mhm.
a bit jarring, isn't it? It's not the Maxim that we've seen so far.
It's not.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you wonder what else he might be capable of.
Right. And then they go for a walk in the woods.
Yeah.
And it's a really nice description of the dense trees, the bluebells starting to bud.
Yeah, it feels like a moment of potential peace and connection.
Yeah. And for a while, Maxim seems to be his usual self. He talks fondly about Frank Crawley, about his loyalty to Manderley.
Right.
But, as we know, this moment of respite is very short-lived.
Right.
Because then we have the encounter with Ben.
Yeah, down on the beach.
Yeah, and at first, his remarks seem harmless enough.
Yeah. He's talking about digging for shells, the tide coming in.
Yeah, very simple things, but then he recognizes Jasper, and he starts making these strange comments about, quote, her going into the sea and never coming back.
Right.
And then he insists that he never said a word.
It's incredibly creepy.
It is. And Maxim's reaction is really explosive.
Oh, it's terrifying.
He's furious. He forbids the narrator from going near the beach or the boathouse ever again. And it's clear that he has these really painful memories associated with that place and with Rebecca.
It's like this wound that's been reopened.
Yeah, exactly. And he immediately apologizes for his outburst.
Right.
He says that he was overwhelmed by the past.
Yeah,
But the damage is done. The narrator has seen this other side of him.
absolutely. And it reinforces that sense that there's something dark and hidden in his past.
Yeah. And then we have this week of cold and rainy weather, which keeps the narrator confined to the house.
Right.
And the sea is constantly there, that sound.
Yeah.
And she starts to overhear these snippets of conversation
Right.
about Rebecca, about the past, and she describes it as this painful pleasure.
Yeah, that phrase is so interesting.
It is. What do you think it means?
I think it speaks to this kind of morbid curiosity that we all have, right?
Yeah.
This desire to know things that are, perhaps better left unknown.
And maybe this desire to piece together this puzzle, right?
Absolutely.
This mystery of who Rebecca was.
Yeah. And the narrator is also forced to make these social calls, which are incredibly awkward.
Yes.
There are these long silences, these veiled references to Rebecca.
Yeah,
And it just reinforces the narrator's sense of inadequacy.
absolutely. And then she receives that invitation to the costume ball,
Right.
which she's completely unaware of.
Yeah, it's this long-standing tradition at Manderley.
Right. And Frank Crawley confirms that it was a big event.
Yeah.
But Maxim is silent.
Yeah. Very conspicuous silence.
Yeah. And it just reinforces the narrator's sense of being an outsider.
Right. Like she's still on the outside looking in.
Yeah. And then Frank Crawley tries to reassure her.
Yeah, he's very kind.
He tells her that she's adjusting well, that the criticism she's receiving is unwarranted.
Right.
It's a nice moment of kindness.
Yeah, it is.
And then we have the narrator's friendship with Clarice,
Right.
who, like her, is kind of an outsider at Manderley.
Yeah, she's not really part of the inner circle.
And then Clarice drops that bombshell about Mrs. Danvers.
Yeah. She says that Mrs. Danvers literally worshipped Rebecca.
It's such a revelation.
It is. It changes everything.
It does. How do you think that reframes our understanding of Mrs. Danvers?
I think it makes her behavior make a lot more sense in a kind of disturbing way.
Yeah.
Her coldness, her intensity, her obsession with Rebecca's things.
Yeah.
It all starts to make sense when you realize that she was completely devoted to Rebecca.
And you start to see all those little moments in a new light, don't you?
I do. The way she looks at the narrator, the way she smells of Rebecca's perfume, the way she keeps comparing the two of them.
Yeah. And then there's that incident with the broken Cupid.
Oh, yeah, in the morning room.
Yeah. Mrs. Danvers is so pointed in her remarks, even though Robert admits to breaking it.
Right.
And then she says that she needs to be informed of any future mishaps.
It's such a power play.
It is. It's like she's asserting her authority over the house.
Yeah, and her connection to Rebecca.
And Maxim just agrees to send the broken pieces to London. It's like he's just trying to avoid any conflict.
He doesn't want to deal with it.
And then there's that moment where Maxim surprises the narrator by knowing about Clarice's family background.
Right.
And he contrasts it with the bishop's wife, who doesn't seem to know anything about the narrator.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the narrator's own feelings of not belonging, of not being accepted.
Totally. And then Maxim has that really introspective moment where he reflects on the age difference between them.
Yeah.
And he wonders if he was selfish to marry her.
It's a difficult moment.
It is.
And it really upsets the narrator.
Yeah. And then, of course, they have that conversation about the Cupid.
Right.
And it turns out
Yeah.
that it was a wedding gift to Rebecca.
Yeah.
Which is just another one of those little blows to the narrator.
Absolutely. And then Maxim says Rebecca's name.
Yeah.
And he stares into the fire.
Yeah. It's a really poignant moment.
It is. And the narrator thinks to herself, he thinks of Rebecca.
Right. And it's clear that Rebecca's memory is still very much alive for him.
And then we have the encounter with Ben in the morning room.
Yeah. Which is really unsettling.
It is. He's fascinated by Rebecca's fishing line.
Right.
And he's very evasive when the narrator questions him.
Yeah, it just adds to the mystery surrounding Ben.
And then there's that strange man who arrives at the hotel looking for Maxim.
Right.
And he makes that joke about Maxim leaving his young wife alone.
Yeah, it's a really uncomfortable moment.
It is. It shows this other side of Maxim's life.
Yeah, a side that the narrator knows nothing about.
And then we have that incredibly vivid description of Rebecca's bedroom.
Oh, it's so haunting.
It is. You know, the furniture uncovered, her personal belongings on the dressing table, the bed made, flowers everywhere, the silk dressing gown, the slippers.
Yeah, it's like time has stood still in that room.
It is. And the narrator has this feeling of stepping back into the past.
Yeah, she almost expects to see Rebecca there.
And then there's the ticking clock.
Yeah.